This opening slide is not by accident, as it were. This is the real reality of the Border Reivers. We have the three guys, steel helmets, hence the name given to a book written in more recent times called The Steel Bonnets. And this is why these pretty tough helmets were worn by the Reivers. It was, they had a particular style of dress that suited their way of raiding, etc. And there is a part of the Walter Scott sort of romance that's built around the flashing of these helmets in the moonlight would strike fear into the average dweller, farmer, tenant farmer, whatever you want to call it. And a lot of the stories are then invoked about these, because the raids mainly took place at night and mainly in the season of autumn into winter. And that's not a mistake. So this is a typical example of three Reivers out on a raid, and you'll see, we'll come to it through the course of the talk, the style of this fashion of dress, whatever. So who were the Reivers? Well, the word Reiv is from Old English for rob. So the name ties in very nicely. They were robbers. But not in the conventional sense, or even in the sense that Ian and Cara last talk we had talking about the rapparees here in Ireland. This became a way of life for probably quite a few thousand along the borders of England and Scotland. Okay? So there are dozens of families who were the primary core of this, but it spread out into maybe 100 plus families across the English and Scottish borders. It mainly happened between the 14th and 17th centuries. It came to an abrupt end around the early 1600s, and Ian will explain later why. It came about as a way of survival, a way of life. And some of you may know about the terrible wars that there were between England and Scotland, and they were awful by any standard. You've maybe heard of Edward Longshanks, and of course his great battles with William Wallace. Very often when one side was wanting to make a statement against the other, the retribution was terrible. Edward I laid waste to the town of Berwick and basically left nothing alive, not even the animals. The Scots similarly could march as far south as York and inflict similar horrific damage on the inhabitants there. So the wars were terrible and the death toll was horrendous. Farms would be razed to the ground, crops burnt, animals destroyed or taken off to feed armies. But in the middle of this were the people who called the Scottish and English border their home. So they had to live through all of this. Now you could say to yourself, well hold on, some of them are Scots and some of them are English, maybe they were taking part in this. Well, they did to a degree, but the point was this was their home, was this border area, and this is where they'd evolved over the centuries. So eventually they took the hint. How on earth can you possibly exist in a normal life when at the mere whim some English king will march north and destroy everything you have, or vice versa, a Scottish king or queen will march south and do the same thing. So they very quickly learned a survival way of life, and that was based loosely around farming. Don't get me wrong, they were farmers and they were nomadic farmers, but this became a way of survival. The principle being taking what you could, and it became a way of life. They had no firm allegiances to God, king or country. If they did it only when it suited them. The core allegiance was to family, and I want you to bear that in mind, because this is the key to Reiver thinking. Family first and last, every time. Okay? And this basically becomes what everything in Reiver society is based around. Through time, some of the families would become infamous for their ruthlessness and their pursuit of other people's possessions. It was generally a way of life for a lot of families, but some of them got really good at it. I mean, scarily good at it. And it wasn't, of course, until the early 1600s, this man here, James I of Scotland and England, with the Union of the Crowns, which gave them the opportunity to bring this crowd under control, put it down with equal ruthlessness. And again, we'll come to that. And of course, leading on, many of them would form part of the Ulster plantation. So the first thing I want to show you here is an old map of the Scottish and English border. The North Sea up here, the top right, and the Solway Firth down here. So town of Berwick is up here. There's Gretna and Carlisle. And there's the border running along here. It's not as easy to make out in this map, but I'll just show you. You'll see phrases such as Middle March, East March on that side of the border, Middle March on that side of the border, West March. And really what that's about, there's another West March here, is in an effort for both sides, the Scottish throne and the English throne, to deal with this band of cutthroats. They couldn't use conventional law, it wouldn't work, and they couldn't afford to keep sending armies against them when they were doing their activities. So they came up with a kind of awful halfway house, which in some ridiculous way took into account their way of life. And they divided up the border into 3 marches, areas on either side. You had the Scottish West, Middle and East March, and similarly the English West, Middle and East March. In each of these marches they would appoint a sort of a headman, as it would be in old Scots, a headman. And he would be the head bobcat, as we would talk about in the area. Now, you would say to yourself, right, how does that work? Well, it sort of did and it didn't, because the problem was the headman was usually a Reiver. So, you know, I can't remember the exact phrase about it, but it's like letting the fox look after the chickens or something like that. They would perform the duties of local law enforcement, but the idea being that as long as they were doing all right, and I'll come to a wee story probably involving one of my ancestors, maybe, I can't prove it. But you'll see on this map here, it mentions some of the names. I'll show more detail, but in this map it sort of lays out the different families and where they lived in these marches all along the border. That's basically what you have. That explains the geography of the Scottish and English border and the marches and areas of control that existed on it. Now, a rough list of names. Now this isn't an absolutely comprehensive list, and I'm sorry it's maybe a bit small to read, but there's a lot. There's over 100 there. But what I've done there is that I have highlighted some in blue that would have some relationship with here. Anderson, Armstrong, Beatty, Bell, Burns, Graham, Halliday, Foster, Elliott, Davison, Jardine, Young, Wilson. This was an interesting one I discovered as recently as last night. Trimble, originally Turnbull. Now, we all have that problem here in Ireland of how genuine is your name, and in a lot of cases it's not. You can understand how the pronunciation has worked to something different. And I think that's what we have to realise when we come to talk later about Reiver families becoming part of the plantation. When you're trying to understand your family heritage and your background, try and understand the name through its pronunciation rather than how you see it spelled today. It's a lot more helpful in trying to research your background. What you have to remember is that at the time of the plantation you have maybe 6, 7 different dialects going about, you know, in maybe 2, 3 distinct languages. And things get a bit messy, and hence all these names get messy along with it. So spelling variations are a big factor. Another thing to bear in mind is some of those names you might not immediately identify with planter background as far as your own local history is concerned. But for that reason you have to bear this in mind too. I said to you that the Reivers originated as far back as the 14th century. So reiving predates the Reformation. So you have to get that into your head as well. Reiver ancestry is pre-Reformation. So that's something else you have to bear in mind. Okay? So, now amongst all those different families, and there are other ones to say aren't on that list, you could make it even more comprehensive, but you get to these more powerful families. And this is the core of reiving on the borders. These are the real bad guys.
Where's Cully?
Funny enough, Cully doesn't hear anymore. Sorry, Raymond. Where are you? And I really do mean that. I'm sorry if I'm offending anybody in here with that name up there. But Reivers nothing to go really. I mean, it's part of your heritage, but you know, it's not nice. It wasn't a great way of life either for the Reivers themselves and their victims. But most of these names have some appalling stories behind them. And I'll give an example now of one involving possibly my own ancestors, but they're not on the big hit list. But that doesn't excuse them. The Greys, for a while, became the march wardens for the English East March. And one of the stories that's told in the book, The Steel Bonnets, was an old man Grey, who was 70, by the way, or older, had convened a truce day, and I'll come to those in a minute. And on the truce day, you basically weren't to misbehave. There would be a meeting together of the various families in the area and grievances. The idea being would be sorted out. You know, sorted out in Reaver technology or terminology. It's not what we would call political debate by today's standards. But anyway, the truce day took place, various meetings were held, blah, 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 blah. But old man Grey had decided he'd had enough of a particular opponent in the march and was not going to let this opportunity of a truce day go amiss. So his opponent was in the local hostelry and was well oiled when old man Grey set upon him coming out of the pub and duly put him to the sword in an instant. Of course, nothing was said about it because who was the local law enforcement? Old man Grey. And I think you have to understand this is the kind of mentality you're dealing with. That even when there is some sort of structure, it's quite ruthless and there's not much in the way of democracy. But amongst these names, you'll see some local names that are here, which may have a heritage to these particular families. I mentioned Turnbull's being Trimble, Maxwell, Graham, Halls, and I'll come to those Bells and Armstrongs. Two of the names on this list that are probably some of the most famous or infamous amongst the Reivers are the Armstrongs and the Grahams. You'll see it in Old Scots, the Armstrongs are referred to as the Armstrangs, is the way it can be often pronounced. But the main mention of those two names in parts of the Scots and English borders would literally make your blood curdle, because the stories that surrounded their ruthlessness were, laid down for 2 centuries of history, and they were not to be messed with. But most of these families would all have this kind of bloody history behind them, where it has elevated them to a degree of success within their own culture. Some of them went on to become, like old man Grey did, a march warden, and that could yield certain benefits, even from the thrones, because the thrones would use these families for their own ends as well. But they always, if they were wise, had an eye to the fact that don't trust them. If you get any benefits out of it, fine, but don't expect that these are loyal subjects, because they certainly were not. Now, this little map here is a wee bit more detailed. Looking at the west and middle marches of Scotland and England, you'll see some of the highlighted names would tie in with local names. Kerrs, Armstrongs, Grahams, Elliots, Maxwells, and these highlighted ones are of course more of the famous. Interesting other ones maybe, Carton, we have along here. Again, you're looking at, here's Gretna down here again, and Berwick is off in this direction. So it's giving me an idea of location with these families, where they're coming from, and here's the Scottish and English border going up down through there. Tying the Otterburn, Hermitage, Langholm, Longton. And I mean, some of these towns and villages become synonymous with the horror stories of Reaver raids and attacks and all the rest of it. So, one of the great things, again, about looking at it in the context of family history with the Reivers, I suppose you could look at it this way: if it hadn't been for their infamy, we wouldn't have this sort of detail to refer back to. For many people of a planter background in Ulster, they're given a very general heritage of, you probably came from southwest Scotland. the lowlands, south of Glasgow, whatever, Dumfriesshire, Lanarkshire, that sort of thing. And I know probably with my own family background, that's probably the case too, because a lot of the families built up their heritage over this period in the borders. It didn't mean they were totally tied to it. There's bells down here, there's another local one as well, Scott. Pots, another one. Yes, yes. And the thing too that you're picking up on here is you'll notice yourself that there are names that are very distinctly English in their sounding. But the thing is to remember that they're not English as in, how can I describe it, sort of cultured, well-behaved, nice, sensible, level-headed kind of background. You know, this is a different kind of thing. I mean, they did accept a degree of identity with being either an English borderer or a Scots borderer, but a borderer first. If you can understand it from that way. When they fought for either crown, they would identify themselves either with the Blue Cross of St Andrew as a Scots borderer or as the English Cross of St George as an English borderer. But they were still borderers. And on that subject is a lovely little aside. During one of the great battles between Scotland and England, in the height of battle, there was an English border detachment on the English army side and a Scots border detachment on the Scots army side. And in the middle of the battle, the commander of the, I think it was the Scottish army, happened to notice that the two border protagonists had stopped fighting and were basically having a cup of tea in the middle of the battlefield discussing old times. And that again proves the lack of conformity and trustability, if you like, of the border families. One Scots, one English, and this is a war between the two realms, but it's not really anything to do with us. And this is what you're having to bear in mind the whole time with the border Reivers.
The other thing, John, is
Yep.
the border with Scotland was really confirmed in the early 1600s.
Yeah.
At some stage earlier, it was down as far as York.
Yeah, the reference is made to the debatable lands.
Yeah.
Basically, really because of the war and the inability through distance or otherwise from the two sort of headquarters, if you like, of the Scots and English thrones, it really wasn't conceivable. Even if the Reivers had not been there, it was very difficult to mark a border in a defined way. And that really what that helped to do was it aided the border Reivers in setting up the situation in the way that they did. So, Reiver lifestyle. As I said, that some of the Reivers grew into success and became march wardens and other things. But a large majority of them were quite fairly poor farmers. It was a rural existence in lowland Scotland, and what they would tend to do was they would rear their cattle and their sheep on the high ground in the Highlands in the summer months, and they would live with the animals, both to protect them and just manage them better. They would live in temporary dwellings, sod buildings, whatever you want to call them. And then in the winter months, bring them to lower ground, protect them, and they would move into more substantive structures. And of course, the whole time you're aware where you are. How do you defend your cattle? You can't just leave them lying out there without some degree of protection. So we'll come in a wee moment to the kind of way that they had to manage that. The winter months was the big problem. Reaving took place quite strict. Now, it did occur during the spring and summer, but 90% of it took place during the autumn and winter, under the cover of darkness, where it was easy to get away with things. One of the things about Reivers, it's not just a ruthlessness in doing things the way that they do. They're good at it. They're crafty. They're scheming. And I think you have to be aware that their way of life has a kind of efficiency to it. They're never going to do things the hard way, because that doesn't need rewards. There's no heroics involved. I think Eamon in the talk last month there about the rapparees was, they have this romantic notion that they almost are heroic figures. One rapparee can take on 9 ordinary men, all this sort of thing. And of course, what Eamon was telling us was that's nonsense. They were just as averse to tackling a 70-year-old widow on her own as they were to taking on a family. These guys were no different. You know, there were big raids. One raid was quite legendary. 3,000 Reivers took part in that raid, and it went on for days. They would march as far south as some of the cities in some cases, but they were quite rare. The vast majority of raiding was taken off local tenant farmers. And again, as I said before, allegiance was first and foremost to family and clan, and a very loose acknowledgement of God or faith, and certainly not to law or crime. Another thing that explains a problem too in how the Reiver lifestyle comes about is this thing here, gravel kind or gravel kin. And really what happens in that is when the head or headman of the house dies, his lands are divided up equally amongst his sons. Now you can imagine that creates absolute mayhem as far as consistency goes, and basically starts a lottery of grab all, because maybe a lot of land that might sustain a family grouping under one person or even under two is suddenly divided up amongst 4, 5, 6, whatever it is. Maybe in a situation where for all of them it's unsustainable. So how then do you live? Well, you go and grab what's not yours. So you can see how this ancient tradition then becomes part of the problem. We talked about the legal system that became part of their way of life. It was known in Latin as leges martiarum, or the border laws, and we'll come to aspects of the border laws in a wee moment. But that's typical of your Reiver lifestyle. So in essence, they're fairly simplistic in their farming lifestyle. They're grazing cattle, they're grazing sheep, in a way that's not unrecognisable with Ireland at the same time period, which was a nomadic lifestyle with not so much a fixed farm ideology, but moving with the seasons and with the tide. And they too, you only have to look at the annals of Ulster, and you'll see, you know, famous raids by one clan on another. But that would have been on a much, you know, more geographical scale. Now, border law. This interesting wee sketch is of an example of a day of truce under border law. But basically, as I said to you earlier, an example of a day of truce is everybody has to behave themselves. Very rarely worked out that way, but that was the intention. And it was probably that one potentially quiet moment in the mayhem when you might be able to air a grievance over a table and over a discussion, and it might be resolved. In this particular example, we see a Scottish marsh warden in this picture here. And over here we have the English marsh warden. You see different style dress. He's wearing the blue for Cross St Andrew and the red for St George. We see a border headman who's obviously airing some kind of grievance. The poor clerk is terrified that he takes something down wrong and doesn't make it home that night. Not a typical court session. And one of my favourite parts of this picture is the guy here with the pistol brandished under his cloak. He obviously has the dodgy job of trying to call order if it starts to get cut up a bit rough. But this would have gone on through the year, these truce days, in an attempt to try and bring some sort of order, resolve disputes without it leading to literally bloody mayhem. But unfortunately, more often than not, it was bloody mayhem that came to bear in these sort of situations. The actual idea of the raid, this is another nice little picture. And here we sort of see a border headman with one of his main sort of, well, he's not foot, so they're cavalry by principle, his son over here, and then effectively a foot soldier. And this is a good way of introducing the kind of dress, the weaponry, and the way that the Reivers carried out their raids. They've mentioned to me about the steel bonnet, the steel helmet on the head. Again, not fairly typical of Elizabethan and sort of Tudor times. He's well able to, you know, he's got a steel breastplate or a metal breastplate. The horses they're on were generally Galloway ponies, and I think the breed is a cobbler. How does that make any sense? A cobbler, is it a type of pony? But basically, they're not very tall, as you can see. They're squat, they're very strong, and they were on shoot, all the idea being they were adapted to cross rough ground, hold their footing well, bogs, moorland, all that sort of thing. The weapon of choice for the Reiver was this lance, absolutely lethal in their hands, either thrown or just simply stabbed into you, and in most cases they'd have remained on the horse the whole time. Whenever I was looking into the Reivers, the thing that struck me about this choice of battle wear, whatever you want to call it, if you think back to the Normans who came over with the Conqueror in the 11th century and defeated Harold, one of the things that Harold had a real problem dealing with was the Norman cavalry. And the Norman cavalry was very, very similar to this. They were short, squat horses. The cavalry did not wear heavy armour, and again, they would have used stabbing implements, and they were lethal. They were light, very hard to resist under any circumstances. So this would be a typical sort of scene on the borders around that period. See the cattle in the background. These men are either defending their position on the basis that there may be an imminent attack, or that they've actually come back from an attack and this is somebody else's animals. That's the way of life that you're dealing with on the borders. Now, I mentioned about that lifestyle, that sort of semi-nomadic existence of farming in the Highlands during the summer. Back down the hill again, and this would be a more typical dwelling house for a Reiver family, a basel house. It's a fairly bleak looking structure, but the principle behind it is more for defence rather than comfort. There would have been a mixture of situations, either the animals, in the larger ones the animals would have been inside with the family, and these smaller ones that would obviously have to be kept outside or in lean-tos or whatever. But the average Reiver family would have sought to have created a house of that sort of structure for defending and keeping things safe during those autumn and winter months. And that's a nice typical example of one from the borders.
You kept the animals on the ground floor and then let people...
And in fact that principle is used all over the world, even still. And in Switzerland, I think, they still would keep the animals in the winter months downstairs and through the heat. This is one of the famous border tower houses. And this is probably a Victorian piece of artwork. It, to me, sort of conjures up some of that romanticism, the Sir Walter Scott thing. When I look at that picture, it just looks beautiful to me. It doesn't look like there's anything threatening or violent about it. You just see these guys on horseback, the cattle, and this beautiful sort of romantic castle-like structure in the background. Certainly there were tower houses, but there was nothing romantic about them. They were very efficient at doing their job, and that was trying to keep the neighbours at bay. But it's an example of another one of the typical structures of houses. Another thing to bear in mind with our own local history is that many of the fortifications that were built here during the plantation took on the same style, the tower house. And then, if you're really lucky and you're worth it, you get something like that, which is Hermitage Castle. Now, unfortunately, I've forgotten the name of the family that owned that, but they were one of the March Wardens. They were one of the more powerful families. And we know that Mary Queen of Scots actually stayed in Hermitage Castle during her lifetime. So, I mean, it was considered important enough that even royalty could stay in it. But it is an absolutely formidable looking structure, even by castle standards. It's not huge, but there's just something very dominant in the landscape and the statement about it. The sort of "don't mess with me" written all over it, I think. Now, Reiver languages and customs. Now, you'll recognise some of these phrases when they pop up on the screen. And I'm sorry they're very bleak. That's the bleak people you're dealing with. Just some of the phrases: blackmail, blood feud, protection racket, kidnapping, the hot rod, and I'll explain the hot rod soon, and posse. Now, this word in particular is very definitely unique in its origins from the Reaver times. Blackmail comes from black meal, and it's tied into this carry-on. Reaver families would extort meal by day or by night from local inhabitants. The night meal extortion was called black meal, or blackmail as it then became famous in history. And it was white meal or white meal for the daytime. And basically the principle is no different than the principle today. Keep paying me and I make sure that you don't get hit by anybody else. And more importantly, that I won't attack you. And it went on all over the borders. It was a very, and again I come back to this, it's a very efficient way of survival for these families. The blood feud, as mentioned earlier about family is everything for the Reivers. And part of that was to carry a major problem for them. If one family killed a member of another family, it very often would spark off the blood feud. And there would be retaliation killings that would go on, believe it or not, some of them for centuries. If you've heard of the phrase hillbilly, which was sort of generalistically attached to people living in the Appalachian Mountains in the United States, some of those families have Reaver ancestry. And some of them, even then, attached the blood feud about families that maybe 200 years plus they had had dealings with. But it was a big problem in trying to bring any kind of order to the border area, was the blood feud. And in fact, the funny thing about it was the Reaver families themselves went to a degree of length to avoid it. If you could carry off a raid without killing, it was not something that you'd be necessarily proud of, but it was a good, efficient way of doing it. Because the trouble with making a kill on the raid is the others were honor bound to come back and do the same thing to you, and thus it would go on. Kidnapping, another great way of procuring wealth and possession, that went on. And these other two things, hot trod is how it would have been known in border Reaver times, and it was part of border law. Posse is how we would probably understand it in terms of the Wild West. Basically, in the hot trod, it was a hot pursuit of Reivers and was allowed under the border laws. It allowed for the ones who had been spoiled, attacked, to mount a pursuit within 6 days of the raid and to cross the border, if necessary, to follow the raiders with hound and horn for the recovery of their goods. It was the duty of, it gets really complicated. It was the duty of all neighbours between the ages of 16 and 60 to join the trod, or posse. A piece of burning turf was held aloft on a spear point to let others know what was happening, so you couldn't avoid it. The posse in pursuit had the right to recruit help from the first town it came to, and the first person encountered was to bear witness that a lawful hot trod was being carried out. When told to join the hot trod, if a person refused, he would be considered to be a traitor and to be in cahoots with the enemy. The person who refused would also be forced to become a fugitive. The hot trod puts one in mind of the posses of old American West. What it doesn't say there is that if you refused to join very often, you were killed. End of story. So, it's funny again how, we come to this all the time, how Reaver background finds its way into more modern culture. And the Wild West of America of the 1850s and 60s and whatnot has a lot of linkage. Possibly families were aware of the Reaver history, but again, it's a lawless land. And you have the cattle barons are not unlike some of the Reaver families. They become the local law enforcement. They organise things to suit themselves and their own monetary gain. And of course the law tries to deal with it by creating the posse, the recruiting of local people as temporary deputies in pursuit of these guys. So it's interesting how these things tend to follow on. Now, we come to an interesting part of the story. and this is where I have to do a bit of method acting, so please forgive me if it's appalling. On the screen you'll see a piece of public art or sculpture. This is in Carlisle, okay? And I can't remember the year it was put together, but it's there anyway. And it relates, you'll see a lot of Reivers family names carved in the floor area of this sculpture. And then this great stone, and you'll see some text is carved on. And this text is the Bishop's Curse of 1525. Alright? Now this is Bishop Gavin Dunbar of Glasgow. Okay? Now, before I read out the curse to you, or part of it, in Old Scots, so it might be a shambles, you need to understand what this curse is. This was probably the heyday of reading. It really was a nightmare to both thrones. It was a nightmare to the church, who certainly were not benefiting out of its existence, and if anything were complete opposite. Their churches weren't being attacked by Reivers. They certainly weren't paying heed to them. And at this particular point in time, Gavin Dunbar loses the plot, and he decides to deliver a curse. And this curse was read out from every chapel in the borders. Every chapel. It was official business. And to understand that it's not just a phrase, a turn of phrase curse, you have to understand that this almost has legal purpose behind it. If a curse at that time was delivered by the church officially from the pulpit, it could not be rescinded. So if you, as a Reiver, said, look, I don't want to be a Reiver anymore, I want to be a good guy, can you not take this curse off me? Couldn't be done. We're not talking about going to confession and saying, I want to be a good guy now, it's okay, your sin's forgiven. This is non-refundable. This is possibly the worst thing the church could officially do to an individual or a group of people. But if you hear the language, I'll say, could get embarrassing this. I've tried to rehearse it, but I'm not well removed from my old Scots, but I'll do my best. It's best read in the old Scots. So, I curse their heed and all the hairs of their head. I curse their face, their een, their mouth, their nose, their tongue, their teeth, their crag, their shoulders, their breast, their heart, their stomach, their back, their womb, their arms, their legs, their hands, their feet, and every ilk part of their body. Frae the top of their head to the sole of their feet, before and behind, within and without. I curse them going and I curse them riding. I curse them standing and I curse them sitting. I curse them eating. I curse them drinking. And I curse them walking. I curse them sleeping. I curse them rising. And I curse them lying. I curse them at home. I curse them away. I curse them within the house. I curse them without the house. I curse their wives, their bairns, and their servants, participating with them in their deeds. I curse their cornies, their stables, their wool, their scalp, their horse, their swine, their geese, their hens, and all their livestock. I curse their halls, their challeries, their kitchens, their stables, their barns, their byres, their barnyards, and their vegetable patches. I can't pronounce the old Scots for that, my apologies. Their ploughs, their harrows, and their goods and houses that is necessary for their sustaining and welfare. Nasty stuff. So, I mean, it's a bit of fun, but you have to understand that is what I said it was. That was an official church business. As far as the church was concerned, these were the lowest form of human life, and they deserved to be treated as such. They were beyond the pale, as we talked about in old Irish history. So any of that romanticism that you have left, you understand that really, for most people, it had gone far enough. Now, a lovely little aside to this about the curse, regardless of what your spiritual beliefs are. The story goes that from this monument or sculpture was put together, the two awful things have befallen the city of Carlisle since it was put there. One of them being terrible flooding, quite recently. So locals in Carlisle are really nervous about this thing, and a lot of them would like to see it removed forthwith because they're now convinced that has literally hexed the entire town of Caroline on top of it. So, but it's a night. I mean, it has an element of humour, I suppose, in the pronunciation. But if you were living at those times back then, you'd realise that it was very serious business. This is a bit talking about the Reaver legacy as a group of people, their way of life, their beliefs, their way of doing things, has all had an impact on history, both in the borders and beyond. Firstly, their fighting spirit. Okay, they're sort of like guerrilla fighters and all the rest, and people might have heard of the gallows glass and all the rest of it. These guys were probably the original super light cavalry. They were used in wars all over Europe, and they were pretty good. One of the things that's interesting to note, when border Reiver units were here in Ireland before the plantation, they were very successful. After the plantation, when they had been more or less wiped out or assimilated or whatever you want to call it, not so successful. But this is a lovely line here. After meeting one Reiver, the bold Bulick, Queen Elizabeth I is quoted as having said that with 10,000 such men, James, the 6th of Scotland, I think, could shake any throne in Europe. Now, you could just say, oh, well, that's just a bit of romantic language from Elizabeth I. But Elizabeth was no dozy when it came to military matters. She was well read, well schooled, and she was Henry VIII's daughter. I don't think that was said by any degree of romanticism or accident. She had great admiration for these guys' capabilities as warriors. They were really something to behold. So we say they get drafted as mercenaries all over the place. And one of the interesting asides to this light cavalry thing, in more recent history locally here at Fort Edward was a detachment of light cavalry in the 1790s. 124 of them. It's not lost on me that many of those men were actually taken to a military pastime that their own forefathers had been incredibly good at. They would have been very good people in their knowledge of horses and in that whole realm. It was a way of life that they couldn't do without. So interesting how it may well have impacted in other aspects. Family loyalty. I said to you, family comes first. I talked earlier on about the feud. Not just against the killer's immediate family, but against anyone with the same surname. Think about mafia here. The modern mafia, even the older mafia, there's a strong sense of family loyalty within mafia families. And very often blood feuds will occur there between mafia families too. And they could last for generations. Feuds between the Maxwells and the Johnsons could amount to 6 battles, while others were settled in single combat. And they could be engaged in several feuds with several other families. And as a way of life, it must have been crazy. There's absolutely nothing normal by anybody's standards that this way of life relates itself to. Now, this is a lovely side to this. The authorities were reluctant to get involved in feuds. Think about this. Why? They could stand back and watch the troublesome families kill each other. But that would only go so far. They would soon quickly cling on and say, hold on, if we're all dead, we can't make anything here. So it wouldn't last forever. But as I said to you before, they were sort of mindful of vendettas and afraid to kill because it could set off something that's going to get in the way of their idea of normal life. And the other thing they tended to avoid was feuding across the border. And the principle behind that was they were mindful of not starting a war between the two countries. Because, what was their history telling them? Wars between England and Scotland are their worst nightmare. Because they get stuck in the middle. And it's their lands, their farms that are destroyed. Non-conformity. The very essence of Reivers. Until they were passed by the 1600s, the border law was basically the only thing that had any control over them, and that was barely, and I mean barely. They certainly showed passing allegiances to crowns, and their attachment to religion was patchy. It's a lovely story. There are all sorts of probably elements of truth and elements of absolute made-up nonsense, but there's a story told of a travelling friar comes across a camp pitched of Reivers, and he said, "Are there any Christians here?" And the reply comes, "No, only Armstrongs and Johnstons. So it's probably more to do with relating to people about their very passing reference to religion. This is my personal favourite. It was said that many Reivers, when baptising their children, would leave the right hand unblessed so that it could wield a sword. That shows you the mentality of what we're dealing with here. There was probably a passing fear of God in some way, but there was always the acknowledgement of reality that your neighbour was your first port of call as to how long your life was going to be. Now, we come to our own local area. And I did some research, firstly on the 1911 census, to look at those family names that are on the accepted sort of list of border families. And see, firstly, where those border families came from, the marches. You remember I said to you about England and Scotland, west, east, middle, whatever. And to look how many of these, and I picked adults, didn't just pick the whole family group or whatever. And it was very interesting, because it firstly showed me there's a lot of them. Now, a lot in the sense that it's only 10% of the total population of everybody in the 1911 census in our area. But that list is actually going to grow, because what I'm discovering is there's names that I don't have in that I didn't think to be Reiver, that I found out are Reiver. So it's going to be a growing list, I have to tell you. But what it was useful for telling me was who were the key families. And what's useful about this is, if you see a lot of individuals with this family name in our area, it's probably a very powerful clue to how far back the origin is. In other words, their connectivity to the plantation period or some time after that. And we'll see the most common names: Kerr, Hall, Johnston, Jemison, Davison, Graham, or Grimes. This is another one of these problems with the pronunciation of names. Grimes is probably a warping of grains. Say it quickly, the A starts to drop and turns into an I and it becomes Grimes. Beatties, it's common to see Beatties spelled the original way, i.e., or with a Y. I've actually Beatties in my own family. Reid, original spelling, 2 E's, R-E-I-D. Dixon, with an X, C-K. There's every likelihood they're all the same. It's just part of this constant changing through time of family names. And you'll see some of the other ones there. But this relates it to our own local history. So if the question's asked, is there Reiver blood in our part of the world? Well, very definitely yes. And that's important because we have to understand how that affected our local history. Because there is an effect of Reivers being here. The other interesting thing is we see that they're from mainly, these larger family groupings are mainly from the middle and west. You'll see this last high occurrency groups: middle, 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 west, middle, west, middle, and on down. S for Scotland, E for England. But quite a few. I reckon at least 25 and probably nearer 30, maybe even 40% of the local planters here have Reiver background. It could be as high as that because of this problem with getting the names right. So,
I just noticed we had the picture up of Carlisle.
yes,
It had Simpson.
yes, yeah. And this is the problem. That list I showed you there, about 102 names, could be a lot bigger.
Yeah.
The reality is, though, that whilst Reiver families were quite, widespread across the borders, there are those that we're particularly good at, and they're the ones that get the reputation and the name and the power and the influence and all the rest of it. So this is the ones that tend to come to the fore. You'll notice this list of common names here is also common to that shortened list I told you of the primary families, the real, if you like, the supremos. But 1 in 10 of those living in collegiate combination 1911 could say with a Reiver background. That's not fair bit. Of those 1 in 10, the majority came from just 14 families. Just 14. I actually would say it's a lot more than 1 in 10, say, when we add in more of the families we don't have noticed. And they could have accounted for 1 in 4 or more of those who came to the area during the plantation. And 9 of the commonest family names originate from the middle marches of Scotland and England. It's 9 of them. 9 of the 10 from the middle. Now that's quite interesting from this perspective. Most of us are told that if you're from a planter background, your ancestors are probably southwest Scotland. No, for these 9 families. Middle. And that possibly will be an aid in researching family backgrounds. You'll not have that connectivity of church records to go through. But if you're trying to see where your family originated prior to plantation, you're probably better looking in the middle marches if you're one of those groups of families. And of course there's the common names again. Ogle is one that has almost died out, but it was relatively common up until about 1911.
There's still ogres down Murphy's direction. They're quite a few.
Yeah. Well, actually, they're one of the more powerful families from the borders, which I was totally unaware of until I was sort of going through all the research. And I mean, Little's obviously, there's George and Ian still live locally here, so that's well known enough. And all these other names, I mean, these names are commonly known to most of us, you know, whether we're growing up here or not. Now, let's bring it forward a wee bit. 2010, we do see some changes. We see some names that weren't in that 1911 bit drop, have come in, new names, and some of the other names have dropped off. You can see the Ogles, is dying out. You're saying, right, there's a few now over that direction. The family that was here historically has, dwindled out over time. Still, you look here, you still see a lot of these common names are still a big influence in our more local geography, as it were. Still a lot of Kerrs, Bells, Elliots, Armstrongs, Beattys, Halls, and Greens and Grimes. So I picked out roughly 161 there, using directories and things from that around that time period. That will grow, as I go into it in even more detail. But they're still here, still a big part of local society, if you think it's. And again, if we just refer back to that wee map, you can again, allow you to connect where those people are from. There's Halls here in the middle, Marches, Elliots, Turnbull, Stroke, Trimble again. That's the main Elliot clan over here. You did get elements of, if you like, the clan or riding. We're called sometimes riding clans or riding families. They weren't really understood as clans in the true Scottish Highland sense. But again, it just allows us to place those within the context of where they were in the geography of the borders at the time for those local families. Now, famous Reivers. Now, you'll never get a more mixed bunch. Now, some of you will look at these names and you'll say, well, that doesn't surprise me. Now, after what you've told me about Reivers, that guy's top of my list. And that's what I would say here tonight. Please, all leave friends, alright? Leave all that Reiver history behind you. Please. It's ancient history, okay? So, it's not a comprehensive list, but it's an interesting one. Now, none of us would think of Bobby Charlton as being the first guy to don a sword and clobber you on a moonlit night on the way home from work. But he's part of the Charlton clan from the border. And he knows that to himself. Most of these people are aware. One of the most famous ones is astronaut Neil Armstrong. And Neil has actually been back to his hereditary root on the borders, and I think he was made a freeman of the town or something like that. And he's well and truly been put in touch with his ancestors. But again, a very likeable, well-mannered guy. You certainly would not, again, associate him. These two here, from a political point of view, would certainly conjure up certain elements. This guy here was certainly quite an irascible character in his political life, and of course we all know about poor Dickie Nixon's dodgy history. But at the same time, regardless of these guys, they were powerful figures in their own right, certainly. Richard Nixon very much was, until his demise. So I think Eric Douglas Home, I put in Hume here because Hume is actually the border family. One of the interesting things is John Hume. I was thinking of, I don't know, Brendan, if that is his genuine, or his name has been anglicised from Irish.
No, he's Scottish.
Well, there you are. But the well-heeled of the Hume clan, their name is known as Home, so you're wondering why there's a variation, but they are Humes. But they built the Home or Hume Empire off the proceeds of bravery. Sir Walter Scott, of course, famously wrote about those times and romanticised them heavily and left us in a kind of a slightly more pacified version of history. Alexander Graham Bell and Ernest Rutherford, the two great scientists. So there's a real mix of people in there, and I have to say, nothing leaps out of the page to really say to you that there's something in the Reiver genes that leaves all Reiver descendants as madmen. Potential of theft and skullduggery. I'm glad to say, because I might be one of them. But it's an interesting group of people, and it just shows you that, you know, those Reivers, when the area was pacified by James, it was pacified very ruthlessly. The basic choice was you lose your life or you leave. James did not want any Reivers left at all if he could help it. He probably allowed some to leave that he could be confident would stick with the programme and act as his servants or vassals in the area and work under the control. Remember, he now is part of a joint throne, and that really was game up to the Reivers. They couldn't play the two sides off. There was no more debatable lands, one throne, one source of law, and he could call it from either side, not a problem. They would take orders from both sides. But they were ruthlessly punished. I don't have the figures for how many were hanged or executed, but it was nasty. It was a purge by anybody's imaginations. And the lucky ones were the ones, I suppose, in a way, that were shipped off to the plantation. But for that reason, we have to bear that in mind. I don't really have a slide up for that, but it's really part of taking the talk on for another time, you know what I mean, is mindsets of the Reivers as they come here in the plantation. They weren't automatically godly people by any stretch, but they certainly had no history of it. So if they came round to it, you know, there was no impetus to do it. Absolutely none whatsoever. There's nothing in their background to suggest they're going to be spiritually driven. Survivors, they are. And I mean, it was not lost on James's plantation that the Elizabethan plantations that had failed, particularly Munster, or Leinster plantation, was that he needed people who were not going to easily be moved. The Reivers knew there was no going back. So if they did settle in Ulster, it was either die there or stay there. And human will to survive, their attitude was to stay. And certainly not, in my own personal interpretation of plantation, is that a lot of the plantation success is probably down to a hefty element of Reivers built into it at every nook and cranny. One of the things that will be interesting to look at is after the 1641 rebellion, most of the places that were routed and sent packing had an English background and a more civilised English background, from what a best way to describe it. Toby Coffey's plantation at Castle Coffey was English, it was not Scots. And there was very little of it left. They were scattered in the four walls. But other plantations that had perhaps a strong Reiver element to them may well have held out. And that'll be something interesting to look at when we're looking more at our own history. So, that's basically my talk on this. I'll have the slides and some more information, and our research will go on the Border Reivers, particularly looking at it from a local perspective, and perhaps looking more into that, what effects these Reiver families have on our own local history, and how